What if the Ice Age never ended? Earth's frozen future explained. Hey there, and welcome back to another quiet journey together. Tonight, we're not going to rush anywhere. There's no hurry, no urgency. Just you, me, and a story that unfolds slowly, like snow falling on a winter morning when the world is still asleep. Before we begin, if you enjoy these calm explorations into history, science, and imagination, take a moment to gently tap that like button. And if you'd like more of these peaceful journeys, consider subscribing. But only if it feels right. No pressure. Just an invitation to join us again sometime. Now, let's ease into tonight's story together. Imagine for a moment that you're standing at the edge of a vast, frozen plain. The sun is just beginning to rise, but it's not the bright, warm sunrise you might know. This sun is softer, paler, almost shy as it peeks over the horizon. The light it casts is gentle, turning the endless snow into shades of pink and gold and the palest blue you've ever seen. The air is cold, yes, but it's a clean cold. Crisp. The kind that makes every breath feel pure. And it's quiet. So wonderfully quiet. The only sound is the whisper of wind moving across the surface of the snow, creating tiny swirls and patterns that last only a moment before disappearing, replaced by new ones. This is a world that never warmed. A world where the Ice Age never ended. Where the great sheets of glacial ice that once covered much of our planet decided to stay, to linger, to make themselves at home for thousands upon thousands of years more. Tonight we're going to explore this world together. Not with fear or worry, but with curiosity and wonder. We'll walk through frozen forests, visit underground cities warmed by the Earth's own heart, meet the creatures that call this eternal winter home, and discover how humanity might have bloomed differently under endless snow. So settle in. Pull your blanket a little closer. Dim the lights if you haven't already. And let's step together into a world of eternal ice, where life moves slowly, deliberately, and where every moment is painted in shades of white and blue. The world that never thawed. In our world, the last major ice age began to retreat around 18,000 years ago. The great glaciers that had covered much of North America, Europe, and Asia slowly melted, revealing the land beneath. Rivers flowed freely again. Forests returned. The climate warmed, and with that warmth came the conditions that allowed human civilization to flourish in the ways we know today. But what if those glaciers never left? What if the orbital variations that brought warmth to our planet simply didn't happen, or happened differently? What if the ice remained persistent and patient, covering the northern reaches of our world in sheets thousands of feet thick? Let's paint this picture slowly, carefully, so you can see it in your mind as you drift towards sleep. The ice sheets would still dominate. Imagine standing in what we know as New York City, except there is no city. There are no buildings, no streets, no harbors. Instead, there is ice. A wall of it, rising thousands of feet into the air, stretching as far as the eye can see in every direction. This glacier moves, but so slowly you'd never notice in a human lifetime. Perhaps a few feet per year, grinding forward with the weight of millennia, carving the land beneath it into new shapes. Much of Canada would be buried. The Great Lakes region would exist only as slight depressions beneath incomprehensible amounts of frozen water. The entirety of Scandinavia would lie under similar ice. Great Britain would be connected to mainland Europe not by a tunnel, but by frozen land, walkable if you were brave enough to make the journey. In the southern hemisphere, the ice would extend further from Antarctica than it does today. The southern tips of South America and Africa would feel the constant presence of glacial cold. New Zealand's southern island would host its own expanding ice fields. But here's what makes this beautiful rather than bleak. The world wouldn't be entirely frozen. There would be zones of habitability, corridors of life, places where humans and animals could exist, adapt, and even thrive. Picture the mid-latitudes. Places like what we call France or northern Spain, or the middle regions of the United States. Here, the climate would be similar to what we might experience today in northern Canada or Siberia. Cold certainly, snowy for much of the year, but livable. Forests would exist here, though they would be different forests than we know. These would be forests of hardy conifers, their branches heavy with snow for 8 or 9 months of the year. Between the trees, the ground would be carpeted in thick moss and lichen. These plants are remarkably resilient, capable of surviving in conditions that would kill most other vegetation. They grow slowly, but they grow nonetheless, creating a soft, greenish-white landscape that glows faintly in the dim winter light. The trees themselves would be adapted to this eternal cold. Their needles would be darker, almost black in some species, designed to absorb every possible photon of the weak sunlight. Their roots would spread wide rather than deep, anchoring themselves in the thin layer of soil that remains unfrozen during the brief summer months. Some of these trees might live for thousands of years, growing just a fraction of an inch each year, their rings so tightly packed that you'd need a microscope to count them. In the summer, and yes, there would still be summers, just cooler and shorter ones, these forests would come alive in subtle ways. Tiny flowers would bloom, their petals thick and waxy to protect against the cold. Insects would emerge for their brief window of activity. Birds would arrive, though they would be different birds than we know today, adapted to this cooler world. Between the forests and the ice sheets would lie the tundra. Vast, rolling plains of low vegetation, permafrost just inches below the surface. This landscape would be painted in subtle colors: the white of snow, the brown of exposed earth, the green and gray of lichen, the occasional burst of color from cold-adapted wildflowers. The oceans would tell their own story. Much of the world's water would be locked up in those massive ice sheets, meaning sea levels would be dramatically lower than today. Coastlines would extend far beyond where they currently lie. Land bridges would exist where today we see only water. You could walk from Asia to North America across the Bering Land Bridge. You could travel from Australia to New Guinea on foot. But the oceans themselves wouldn't freeze entirely. They would be cold, certainly, with ice covering the polar regions much more extensively than today. Pack ice would extend into lower latitudes. Icebergs would be more numerous, drifting in the currents, some of them the size of small countries. Beneath the surface, life would continue. The deep ocean doesn't care much about ice ages. Down there, in the eternal darkness, creatures would go about their business much as they do in our world. But near the surface, beneath the ice, a unique ecosystem would thrive. Tiny organisms would cling to the underside of ice sheets. Fish adapted to near-freezing water would swim in the dim light that filters through. Seals and other marine mammals would find breathing holes, raising their young in dens carved from snow and ice. The sky would look different too. With so much of the planet covered in white, reflecting sunlight back into space, the world would be brighter in some ways, but the sunlight itself would feel weaker. The sun would hang lower in the sky even at noon, casting long shadows across the snow. Sunrises and sunsets would last for hours, painting the ice in shades of orange and pink and purple that would take your breath away. At night, the stars would be extraordinary. With less moisture in the air and no light pollution from cities as we know them, the night sky would be a blanket of light. The Milky Way would stretch overhead like a river of diamonds. The aurora borealis would dance across northern skies with even greater frequency and intensity, powered by the interaction of solar winds and the Earth's magnetic field. And then there would be the silence. In our world, we're surrounded by constant noise. Traffic, construction, the hum of electronics, the buzz of insects in summer. But in this frozen world, especially in the depths of winter, there would be periods of profound quiet. The kind of silence where you can hear your own heartbeat, where the crunch of snow under your feet sounds impossibly loud, where the crack of ice expanding or contracting echoes across the landscape like distant thunder. This would be a world of patience, of slow changes measured in generations rather than seasons. A world where nature dictates the rhythm of life, and that rhythm is deliberate, unhurried, almost meditative. How humans would live. Now, let's think about the people who would call this frozen world home. Humans are remarkably adaptable creatures. We've survived in deserts where temperatures soar above 120 degrees. We've thrived in rainforests where it rains almost every day. We've built communities in the Arctic where winter darkness lasts for months. So in a world where the ice age never ended, humans would find a way. They always do. But how they lived would be fundamentally different from what we know today. First, let's talk about where they would live. The harsh reality is that much of the land would be uninhabitable. Those massive ice sheets covering the northern continents wouldn't support permanent human settlement. The constantly shifting ice, the extreme cold, the lack of resources, it would all make life there virtually impossible for extended periods. So humans would cluster in the habitable zones. The mid-latitude forests and tundra regions we discussed earlier would become the centers of human civilization. But even here, survival above ground would be challenging during the worst of winter. This is where we get to one of the most fascinating aspects of this alternate world. Humans would become builders of underground cities. Imagine descending a long, gently sloping tunnel carved into solid rock. The walls are smooth, worn by countless hands over countless generations. As you walk deeper, the air actually grows warmer. This isn't magic, it's geothermal heat. The earth itself is warm at its core, and the deeper you go, the more you can feel that warmth. The tunnel opens into a vast cavern, but this is no natural cave. This is a city. The ceiling is supported by massive stone pillars, carved and decorated with intricate designs. The floor is paved with flat stones, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. And throughout the space, a soft golden light glows from countless lamps. These lamps wouldn't run on electricity as we know it. Instead, they might burn a carefully refined oil rendered from the fat of large animals. Or they might use a different technology altogether, perhaps capturing and concentrating geothermal heat in special crystals or minerals that emit light when warmed. The light would be gentle, never harsh, creating a perpetual twilight that's easy on the eyes and conducive to rest. The homes within these underground cities would be carved directly into the rock walls, creating natural insulation. Each dwelling would have multiple rooms, their entrances covered with thick curtains made from animal hides or woven plant fibers to retain heat. Inside, the walls would be lined with furs and tapestries, both for warmth and decoration. Families would gather around central hearths, not just for cooking but for heat and light and the simple comfort of fire. These hearths would be carefully designed with chimneys that vent to the surface, the smoke rising through natural fissures or carved channels. The fire would rarely be allowed to go out completely. Keeping the fire alive would be a sacred responsibility, passed from generation to generation. Furniture would be simple but functional. Beds would be piled high with furs and filled with insulating materials like dried moss or feathers. Chairs and tables would be carved from wood or stone, designed to last for generations. Storage would be built into the walls, keeping precious supplies organized and accessible. But life wouldn't be entirely underground. Humans need sunlight, both physically and psychologically. So these underground cities would have connections to surface structures as well. Imagine exiting the city through another tunnel and emerging into a structure built partially above ground. The walls are thick, made from stone and packed earth, designed to retain every bit of heat. The roof is low and sloped, allowing snow to slide off rather than accumulate. Small windows, covered with thin sheets of ice or translucent animal membrane, allow light to filter in while keeping out the worst of the cold. These surface buildings would serve various purposes. Some would be workshops where craftspeople create the tools and items needed for survival. Others would be gathering halls where the community comes together for meetings, celebrations, and shared meals. Still others would be storage facilities for food and supplies that actually benefit from being kept frozen. Connecting these surface structures would be covered walkways, essentially tunnels open on both ends but protected from the worst weather. During severe storms, these could be sealed with heavy doors or curtains, creating protected passages between buildings. Now let's talk about clothing, because in a world of eternal cold, what you wear quite literally determines whether you live or die. The people of this frozen world would be masters of layering. They would understand that trapped air is one of the best insulators, so their clothing would create multiple pockets of warm air between the body and the outside environment. The innermost layer would be soft, probably made from plant fibers or very soft animal hide, worn directly against the skin. This layer would wick away moisture because wetness is the enemy of warmth. Over this would come layers of fur. Not just any fur, but carefully selected pelts from animals adapted to extreme cold. Imagine the thick, dense underfur of Arctic foxes, or the hollow hairs of caribou that trap air and provide incredible insulation. These would be sewn together with meticulous care, using thread made from animal sinew, with every seam sealed to prevent cold air from penetrating. The outer layer would be a longer coat, probably made from the hide of larger animals, treated to be water-resistant. This coat would have a large hood, deep enough to protect the face from biting winds. The cuffs would be tight, preventing cold air from creeping up the sleeves. The hem would fall below the knees, protecting the legs. For the hands, mittens would be preferred over gloves. Mittens keep the fingers together, allowing them to share warmth. They would be oversized, with an inner layer of soft fur and an outer layer of tough hide. Some people might wear two pairs, one inside the other. Feet would be protected by boots made from multiple layers of hide and fur, with the fur turned inward. The soles would be thick and perhaps studded with bone or wood to provide traction on ice. Inside the boots, people would wear thick socks made from wool or felted fur. And perhaps most importantly, everyone would wear face coverings in the coldest weather. These might be masks made from leather with small breathing holes, or they might be simple scarves wrapped multiple times around the lower face. These would protect the delicate tissues of the nose and throat from the worst of the cold. Food would come from various sources, each one vital to survival. Hunting would be primary. Large animals like mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, giant deer, and muskox would provide massive amounts of meat, fat, and materials. Hunting parties would venture out, sometimes for weeks at a time, tracking these great beasts across the frozen landscape. But they wouldn't hunt carelessly. In a world where resources are limited, sustainability would be understood instinctively. Hunters would take only what they need, using every part of each animal. The meat would feed the community. The fat would be rendered for cooking, light, and waterproofing. The bones would become tools and weapons. The hide would become clothing and shelter. The sinew would become thread. Nothing would be wasted. Fishing would also be important, especially in the brief summer months when rivers and lakes are free of ice. But even in winter, people would cut holes through ice and fish in the dark water below, using hooks carved from bone and lines made from braided plant fibers or animal sinew. Plant foods would be scarce but precious. In the short growing season, people would gather everything edible: berries, nuts, roots, certain types of bark, lichen, and moss. These would be dried or frozen for use throughout the long winter. Some communities might develop primitive forms of cold climate agriculture, growing hardy grains or vegetables in protected areas during the brief summer, creating small fields surrounded by windbreaks and using every trick to extend the growing season by even a few days. Preservation would be simpler in some ways than in our world. Meat can be frozen and will keep for months. But people would also smoke and dry meat, creating jerky that's lightweight and long-lasting. Fat would be carefully stored in sealed containers. Berries might be mixed with fat and dried meat to create a high-energy food that can sustain travelers and hunters. Travel in this world would be slow and deliberate. You wouldn't just decide to visit a neighboring community on a whim. Journeys would be planned carefully, undertaken only when necessary or during the more forgiving summer months. The primary mode of transportation would be sleds pulled by animals or humans. These sleds would be works of art in their own right, carefully crafted from wood and bone, with runners that glide smoothly over snow and ice. Larger sleds might be pulled by teams of hardy animals, perhaps something like the dogs we use in our Arctic regions, or possibly domesticated versions of other species that thrive in cold climates. For individuals or small groups, snowshoes would be essential. These would be frames made from wood or bone, with a lattice of leather or sinew straps, distributing weight across a larger surface area and preventing the wearer from sinking into deep snow. In some areas, people might use skis, long runners attached to the feet that allow for faster travel across snowy plains. These would be made from carefully shaped wood, perhaps waxed with animal fat to improve glide. Water travel, when possible during summer months, would use boats made from hide stretched over wooden frames, light enough to be carried but sturdy enough to navigate rivers and coastal waters. But perhaps more important than the physical means of travel would be the knowledge required to travel safely. People would be expert navigators, reading the landscape in ways we've largely forgotten. They would know how to navigate by the stars, by the way snow drifts form around obstacles, by the direction tree branches grow, by the behavior of animals. They would understand weather in intimate detail, able to predict storms hours in advance by reading clouds, feeling changes in air pressure, watching animal behavior. They would know where the ice is thick enough to walk on and where it might crack under your weight. They would know which frozen rivers have dangerous currents beneath the ice and which are safe to cross. Communities would be smaller and more isolated than in our world, but when they did come together, it would be meaningful. Trade would occur not just of goods but of information. News would travel slowly but would be treasured. Marriages might be arranged between communities to maintain genetic diversity and strengthen alliances. And through it all, there would be an understanding that survival depends on cooperation. In a world this harsh, individualism would be tempered by the knowledge that you need your community and your community needs you. Resources would be shared. The young would care for the old. The strong would help the weak. Because everyone understands that their turn will come, and when it does, they'll need help too. Animals of the eternal ice age. Now let's turn our attention to the creatures that would share this frozen world with humans. If the ice age never ended, many of the magnificent animals that went extinct in our timeline would still be walking, swimming, and flying across the earth. Close your eyes and picture this. You're standing on a slight rise looking out over a vast snowy plain. The sun is low on the horizon even though it's midday. And in the distance you see movement. At first it's just dark shapes against the white landscape. But as they come closer, the shapes resolve into something magnificent. Mammoths. A whole herd of them moving slowly across the tundra. These aren't the smaller mammoths that existed near the end of the last ice age. These are the giants, the Columbian mammoths or their close relatives, standing up to 13 feet tall at the shoulder. Their tusks are massive, curving elegantly upward, some of them 12 feet long or more. These tusks aren't just for show. The mammoths use them to sweep snow aside, revealing the vegetation beneath. They use them in battles for dominance during mating season. They use them as tools and weapons. But it's their fur that really captures your attention. Thick, woolly, shaggy fur covers their entire body, some of it hanging so long it nearly drags on the ground. The outer layer is made of long guard hairs, dark brown or reddish, designed to shed water and snow. Beneath this is a layer of incredibly dense underfur, so thick that it can insulate the mammoth even in temperatures far below zero. As the herd moves, you can see the calves, smaller and even shaggier, staying close to their mothers. The adults move with surprising grace for their size, their feet spreading wide with each step to distribute their weight across the snow. They communicate in low rumbles, some too low for human ears to detect, maintaining contact with herd members who might be miles away. Mammoths wouldn't be alone on these frozen plains. Traveling with them, you might see herds of woolly rhinoceros, equally impressive in their own right. Shorter than mammoths but massively built, these creatures sport two horns on their snouts, the front horn sometimes reaching lengths of nearly 3 feet. Their thick, shaggy fur is lighter in color, ranging from blonde to reddish-brown. They're grazers like the mammoths, using their horns to sweep snow aside and their wide lips to crop the tough vegetation. Giant ground sloths, which went extinct in our timeline, might still inhabit the forests and forest edges in this alternate world. These creatures could grow to the size of modern elephants, moving slowly but deliberately through the trees. Unlike their small, tree-dwelling cousins we know from tropical regions, these giants would be heavily furred, adapted to the cold. They would rear up on their hind legs to reach high branches, pulling them down with their massive claws to feast on needles and bark. In the more northern reaches, near the edges of the great ice sheets, musk ox would be even more numerous than in our world. These remarkable animals look like a cross between a bison and a sheep, with long shaggy fur that hangs almost to the ground and distinctive curved horns. When threatened, they form defensive circles with the calves in the center, presenting a wall of horns to any predator. Their fur, or kiviot, is one of the warmest materials in nature, finer and warmer than sheep's wool. Speaking of predators, the carnivores of this frozen world would be equally impressive. Imagine a wolf, but larger. Much larger. The dire wolf, which went extinct in our timeline around 10,000 years ago, would still hunt in packs across the tundra. Standing over 3 feet tall at the shoulder and weighing up to 200 pounds, these wolves would have the strength and tools to bring down prey as large as young mammoths. Their hunting strategies would be sophisticated. A pack might track a herd of caribou for days, testing different individuals, looking for the old, the sick, the young, or the injured. When they finally attack, it would be coordinated, almost choreographed, with different pack members playing different roles. Some would drive the prey toward others waiting in ambush. Some would go for the legs, trying to bring the animal down. Others would target the throat or belly. But the apex predator of this frozen world would be the cave lion, or perhaps another large cat adapted to the cold. Larger than modern lions, these big cats would have thicker fur, especially around their necks and shoulders. They would hunt alone or in small family groups, using stealth and power to bring down prey. Their roars would echo across the frozen landscape, a sound both terrifying and beautiful. The short-faced bear, one of the largest mammalian carnivores ever to exist, might also still roam this world. Standing 12 feet tall when on its hind legs, with long powerful limbs built for running rather than the shambling gait of modern bears, this creature would be both hunter and scavenger. It would have little to fear from any other predator, able to drive wolves or lions away from their kills and claim the meal for itself. In the skies above, birds adapted to the cold would wheel and soar. Massive eagles with wingspans of 10 feet or more would hunt for rabbits, ground squirrels, and other small mammals. Snowy owls, nearly pure white to blend with the landscape, would hunt by day and by night, their acute hearing allowing them to locate prey moving beneath the snow. Ravens, intelligent and adaptable, would follow predators and human hunters alike, waiting for a chance to scavenge. And then there would be the smaller creatures, often overlooked but no less important. Arctic hares, their fur turning pure white in winter, would bound across the snow, their oversized hind feet acting like natural snowshoes. Lemmings, small rodents that live in networks of tunnels beneath the snow, would form the base of the food chain, their population supporting foxes, owls, weasels, and many other predators. Arctic foxes, perfectly adapted to this environment, would change color with the seasons, white in winter and brown in summer. They would follow polar bears and human hunters, scavenging scraps. They would cache food when it's abundant, hiding it in the permafrost where it stays frozen, creating reserves for leaner times. In the brief summer, insects would emerge in clouds. Mosquitoes, midges, and flies would hatch from eggs that survived the winter freeze, living just long enough to reproduce before winter returns. Migratory birds would arrive, taking advantage of the long summer days to raise their young, then departing before the cold returns. Beneath the ice-covered seas, life would continue in the cold, dark water. Seals, their bodies streamlined and heavily insulated with blubber, would hunt for fish and squid. They would maintain breathing holes in the ice, returning to the same spots year after year. In spring, they would haul out onto the ice to give birth to their pups, the ice providing protection from most land-based predators. Walruses, massive and tusked, would gather on ice floes in huge numbers. The males would use their tusks to establish dominance, but also to haul themselves out of the water and to break breathing holes in ice. They would dive deep, using their sensitive whiskers to find clams and other shellfish on the ocean floor. Whales would navigate beneath the ice, following ancient migration routes. Some would sing their haunting songs carrying for miles through the water. In summer, when leads and openings form in the ice, they would surface to breathe, their blows visible from miles away. And in the deepest parts of the ocean, beneath permanent ice shelves, unique ecosystems would thrive. Here, where no light penetrates and the water is near freezing, life would cluster around hydrothermal vents, underwater volcanoes that pump heat and minerals into the water. Strange creatures, some of them bioluminescent, creating their own light in the eternal darkness, would make their homes here. Tube worms, giant clams, blind crabs, and fish with antifreeze proteins in their blood would exist in this alien world, completely independent of the sun. All of these creatures would be woven together in complex ecological relationships. The mammoths and other large herbivores would shape the landscape, their grazing preventing forests from expanding into tundra. Their dung would fertilize the soil, supporting the growth of plants. When they die, their bodies would feed scavengers and decomposers, returning nutrients to the ecosystem. Predators would control herbivore populations, preventing overgrazing. Smaller predators would control rodent populations. Birds would distribute seeds. Insects would pollinate the few plants that flower in this cold world. Everything would be connected, each species playing its role in the grand dance of life. And humans would be part of this dance too, neither separate from nature nor dominant over it, but integrated into it. They would hunt, yes, but they would also be hunted. They would take from the land, but they would also give back. They would be one thread in the intricate web of life on this frozen planet. Technology in a frozen world. In a world where the ice age never ended, human technology would have evolved along a very different path than what we know. Without the climate stability and abundance that allowed for agriculture, urbanization, and eventually industrialization in our timeline, progress would be measured differently. But progress there would be, because humans are problem solvers by nature, and necessity has always been the mother of invention. Let's explore what technology might look like in this alternate frozen world, understanding that it would be technology focused entirely on survival, comfort, and efficient use of limited resources. First, we need to understand that the lack of easily accessible fuel would fundamentally shape technological development. In our world, coal and oil, the products of ancient forests and oceans, powered the Industrial Revolution. But in a world locked in an ice age, those resources would either not exist in the same quantities or would be much harder to access. Instead, humans would become masters of geothermal energy. Remember those underground cities we discussed? They wouldn't just be warmed by ambient geothermal heat. Over generations, humans would develop increasingly sophisticated ways to capture, concentrate, and distribute that heat. Imagine walking through one of those underground cities and seeing networks of channels carved into the rock. Hot water from deep geothermal sources would flow through these channels, radiating heat into the living spaces. In some places, the channels would be covered with thin stone slabs that warm up, creating radiating heat panels. In others, they would be open, allowing steam to rise and warm the air directly. Some clever engineers might even develop a form of geothermal refrigeration. By carefully managing the temperature differential between deep hot zones and the frigid surface, they could create spaces that are cold even by the standards of an Ice Age world, perfect for long-term food storage. Lighting would be another area of technological focus. Burning oil lamps, while functional, are inefficient and create smoke. So humans would seek better solutions. This might lead to the development of what we could call crystal lamps. Certain minerals, when heated, emit light. In our world, we know this as thermoluminescence. Imagine carefully selected and processed crystals or minerals, positioned near heat sources, glowing with a soft, steady light. Different minerals might produce different colors of light, allowing people to create exactly the ambience they desire. Alternatively, or additionally, people might develop bioluminescent lighting. Certain fungi and bacteria produce their own light through chemical reactions. In this frozen world, people might cultivate these organisms, feeding them and maintaining optimal conditions to keep them glowing. Imagine chambers in the underground cities where the walls themselves glow with a soft blue-green light from carefully maintained cultures of luminescent organisms. Transportation technology would be highly refined. The sleds we mentioned earlier would be marvels of engineering, designed for different purposes and conditions. Racing sleds for individual travelers would be light and streamlined. Cargo sleds would be large and sturdy, with sophisticated suspension systems to smooth out the ride over rough ice. Some communities might develop wind-powered sleds, essentially land yachts. Large sails or kites would catch the wind that constantly sweeps across the frozen plains, pulling the sled along at surprising speeds. The drivers of these sleds would be skilled navigators, able to read the wind and adjust their course accordingly. In areas with suitable terrain, people might develop ice roads, carefully maintained routes where the surface is kept smooth and level. In the coldest regions, they might even develop something like railroads, not with steam engines but with sleds that run on smooth tracks carved into the ice, pulled by teams of animals or even by wind power. For vertical transportation in the underground cities, people would develop sophisticated pulley systems. Counterweight elevators, similar to those used in medieval castles but more refined, would allow people and goods to move between different levels of the city. The counterweights might be water-filled containers that can be filled or emptied to balance the load. In areas near the great ice sheets, people might develop technologies for traveling on and through the ice itself. Ice picks and crampons would be refined to an art form, allowing climbers to ascend ice walls with relative safety. Tunneling techniques would advance, with tools for cutting through ice more efficiently, perhaps using heated metal blades or even focused steam to melt passages through glaciers. Communication over distance would be a significant challenge, and solving it would lead to interesting technological developments. Without electricity as we know it, systems like telegraph or radio wouldn't exist. Instead, people might develop extensive networks of signal towers. Imagine tall structures, built at regular intervals across the landscape, visible from one to the next. During the day, these towers would display flags or shaped panels that can be seen from miles away with good visibility. At night, they might use fires with colored smoke or shuttered lamps to send messages. A sophisticated code would develop, allowing complex messages to be sent tower by tower across vast distances. In some regions, people might use sound for communication. Large horns or drums could send signals that travel for miles across the snow. Different rhythms and tones would convey different meanings. Skilled operators would be able to send detailed messages this way, and communities would have people whose job is to listen and interpret these distant signals. For closer-range communication within a community, people might develop speaking tubes, carefully constructed channels that carry sound from one location to another with remarkable clarity. Important buildings in the underground cities would be connected by these tubes, allowing instant communication without requiring messengers. Manufacturing would be focused on durability and efficiency. Everything would need to be built to last because resources for creating new things would be limited. Craftspeople would be highly respected members of society, their skills passed down through apprenticeships that might last years. Metalworking would be particularly important and challenging. Without the easy access to fuels needed for high-temperature forges, metalworkers would need to be incredibly efficient with heat. They might use carefully constructed forges that maximize heat retention, perhaps even capturing and reusing exhaust heat. The metal items they create, tools, weapons, and hardware, would be made to be repaired rather than replaced, with designs that allow for easy maintenance and part replacement. Woodworking would be equally important, and workers would have access to unique materials. Wood from trees that grow slowly in cold climates is incredibly dense and strong. A wooden tool made from such wood might last for generations. Woodworkers would also learn to treat wood with various substances to make it more resistant to moisture and decay, techniques that might involve coating it with animal fats, plant resins, or minerals. Textile production would be highly advanced out of necessity. Remember, good clothing is literally a matter of life and death in this world. People would be experts at working with various materials: plant fibers, animal wool, fur, hide, and sinew. They would develop sophisticated techniques for spinning, weaving, felting, and tanning. Some textiles might incorporate multiple materials, creating composite fabrics with properties superior to any single material alone. Food preservation technology would be critical. Beyond simple freezing, people would develop sophisticated techniques for smoking, drying, fermenting, and otherwise preserving food. They might use salt when available to cure meat and fish. They would know exactly how to dry foods to remove moisture without destroying nutrients. They might develop early forms of canning or sealing, using animal bladders or rendered fat to create airtight seals around preserved foods. Medicine would advance along its own unique path. Without access to many medicinal plants that grow in warmer climates, healers would become experts in the properties of cold climate plants, minerals, and animal products. They would know which lichens have antibiotic properties, which tree barks reduce pain and inflammation, which animal organs contain specific nutrients needed to prevent deficiency diseases. They might develop a sophisticated understanding of surgical techniques, perhaps more advanced than in our medieval period, simply because the risks of infection would be lower in the cold environment. Wounds might be deliberately exposed to extreme cold to numb pain and reduce inflammation before treatment. Healers would understand the importance of cleanliness, perhaps using snow and ice as cleaning agents. For serious injuries or illnesses, some communities might develop something like isolation chambers, small rooms that can be kept extremely cold or relatively warm as needed, allowing healers to precisely control the patient's environment to optimize healing. Advanced communities might even develop early forms of biological science, carefully observing and recording the properties of different organisms. They might maintain gardens of medicinal plants, kept alive in protected underground spaces where temperature and light can be controlled. They might breed animals selectively, not just for food but for specific properties like thicker fur or better temperament. Engineering would reach impressive heights, particularly in the construction of the underground cities themselves. These wouldn't be simple caves but carefully planned and constructed spaces, with sophisticated support structures to prevent collapse, drainage systems to handle any water that seeps in, and ventilation systems that ensure fresh air circulates throughout. Some of the most impressive structures might be the observatories, places where scholars study the stars and sky. These might be built on high points with domes that can be opened to the sky. The domes themselves would be engineering marvels, constructed from materials that insulate well but can be opened when weather permits observation. Inside, carefully crafted instruments would allow for precise measurement of celestial movements. These observations wouldn't be just for intellectual curiosity. In a world where accurate timekeeping and navigation are crucial for survival, astronomy would be an intensely practical science. The positions of stars would guide travelers. The cycles of celestial bodies would mark the passage of seasons. Careful observation might even allow for long-term weather prediction, helping communities prepare for particularly harsh winters or plan for better than usual summers. All of this technology would be integrated into a worldview that values sustainability and long-term thinking. In a world where resources are limited and the environment is harsh, any technology that depletes resources faster than they can be renewed would be recognized as ultimately self-defeating. So the entire technological philosophy would be built around working with the environment, not against it, using resources wisely, and thinking in terms of generations rather than quarters or years. Culture, time, and daily life. Now let's slow down even more and think about what daily life would actually feel like in this frozen world. Because technology and survival strategies are only part of the story. What really defines a culture is how people spend their time when they're not fighting for survival, how they mark the passage of days and seasons, what they value, what they create, and what gives their lives meaning. The rhythm of life would be fundamentally different from what we know. In our world, especially in modern times, we live by the clock. We wake at a certain time, work according to a schedule, eat meals at prescribed hours. But in a world where the sun barely rises in winter and barely sets in summer, time would be experienced differently. During the long winter nights, which in the far north might last for months, humans would shift into a different mode of existence. There would be less emphasis on productivity and more on conservation of energy, of resources, and of warmth. People would sleep more, perhaps 9 or 10 hours a night or even more. But this wouldn't be seen as laziness. It would be understood as a sensible adaptation to the environment. The time awake would be spent on indoor activities. This is when the long-term projects happen, the careful crafts that require patience and concentration. A person might spend weeks carving intricate designs into a piece of ivory, or weaving a complex textile, or learning a new skill from an elder. But more than anything, winter would be the season of stories. Imagine sitting in a dimly lit hall, the fire crackling, perhaps 20 or 30 people gathered together. The storyteller begins to speak, and for the next hour, or 2 or 3, everyone is transported. The stories wouldn't just be entertainment. They would be education, history, law, and philosophy all woven together. Through stories, children would learn the skills they'll need to survive. A tale about a hunter might actually be a lesson in tracking, in reading animal behavior, in knowing when to be patient and when to act decisively. A love story might contain important information about social obligations and family relationships. An adventure might teach geography and the locations of resources or dangers. Stories would preserve history, keeping alive the memory of great events from generations or even centuries ago. In the absence of written records or with limited literacy, oral tradition would be the library of this society. And the best storytellers would have trained memories, able to recite epics that take days to complete, keeping every detail consistent. Music would be equally important. Instruments would be crafted from available materials. Drums from stretched hide, flutes from bone or wood, stringed instruments from animal sinew stretched across carved frames. The music would be haunting and beautiful, often mimicking the sounds of the natural world, the howl of wind, the crack of ice, the calls of animals. Songs would serve multiple purposes. Some would be work songs, their rhythms helping groups coordinate their efforts when performing difficult tasks. Others would be lullabies calming children to sleep. Some would be teaching songs, their lyrics containing important information disguised as verse, easier to remember than plain speech. And others would simply be beautiful, expressions of emotion and creativity that remind people there's more to life than mere survival. Dancing would happen too, though perhaps not in the way we might imagine. In the limited space of underground halls, dance would be more about careful movements than athletic leaps. Some dances might be ritualistic, telling stories through motion. Others might be social, ways for young people to interact in court in a supervised, acceptable manner. And some might be pure celebration, bodies moving for the simple joy of movement. Artistic expression would flourish in unexpected ways. With limited materials, people would find creative outlets wherever they could. Bone and ivory would be carved into intricate figures, both functional items like needle cases or buttons, and purely decorative pieces. Walls of the underground cities would be decorated with paintings or carvings, depicting important events, spiritual beliefs, or simply beautiful scenes imagined by the artist. Clothing would become a canvas for artistic expression. Embroidery and beadwork, using materials like shells, stones, or carved bone, would transform functional garments into works of art. Patterns and designs would often have meaning, indicating family lineage, achievements, or spiritual affiliations. Personal adornment would be important too, not from vanity but as a form of identity and expression. People might wear jewelry made from carved bone, stones, or fossilized materials found in the ice. Hair would be braided or styled in ways that indicate status, family, or personal preference. Spiritual and religious life would be deeply integrated into daily existence. Remember, this would be a world where nature's power is obvious and undeniable. Storms can kill. Ice can swallow the unwary. Animals can nurture or destroy. In such a world, the spiritual realm would feel very real and very close. Rituals would mark important transitions and times. The return of the sun after the long winter darkness would be celebrated with joy and ceremony. The first successful hunt of the season might require ritual thanks to the spirits of the animals. Births, deaths, coming of age, marriages, all would be marked with specific rites that connect the individual event to the larger spiritual framework of the culture. Some individuals would be recognized as having special spiritual gifts, perhaps shamans or seers who can communicate with the spirit world, heal the sick, or interpret omens. These individuals would hold important positions in society, consulted before major decisions and called upon in times of crisis. Places would have spiritual significance too. Certain mountains, caves, or ice formations might be considered sacred, places where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds is thin. People might make pilgrimages to these places, or perform specific rituals there at certain times of the year. The relationship with animals would be complex and deeply spiritual. Hunters would understand that they're taking life to sustain their own, and this wouldn't be done casually. There would be respect for the prey, perhaps prayers or rituals before and after a hunt, acknowledgement of the sacrifice the animal has made. Education would be practical but thorough. Children wouldn't attend school as we know it. Instead, they would learn by doing, by watching and participating in the daily life of the community. A child might start learning to sew or carve at age 4 or 5, making simple stitches or cuts under supervision. By their teenage years, they would be producing useful items. Some individuals might show particular aptitude for certain skills and would receive more intensive training, becoming specialists in that area. But education wouldn't only be practical. Children would also be taught the stories, songs, and spiritual traditions of their people. They would learn to navigate by the stars, to read weather signs, to understand animal behavior. They would learn the social rules and obligations that bind the community together. All of this would be passed down not through textbooks but through experience, observation, and oral instruction. The concept of time itself would be different. Without precise clocks, and with the sun being an unreliable marker for much of the year, people might measure time in different ways. They might track the phases of the moon, which remain consistent even when the sun doesn't. They might measure time by tasks, saying something takes as long as it takes to boil water, or as long as a story. They might mark the passage of the year by observing animal migrations, plant growth cycles, or the positions of stars. This different relationship with time would create a different pace of life. Things would get done when they get done, not according to a rigid schedule. There would be busy times, like the brief summer when every moment of good weather must be used for gathering and preparing. But there would also be slow times, like the deep winter when there's nothing to do but wait for spring, and rushing would gain nothing. The sense of community would be strong, born of necessity but also of genuine human connection. In a small community where everyone knows everyone else, where survival depends on cooperation, individualism would be tempered by collective responsibility. Decisions affecting the whole community would be made collectively, with input from elders, skilled individuals, and anyone else who might have relevant knowledge or perspective. Disputes would need to be resolved carefully because in a small, isolated community, you can't just avoid someone you've had a conflict with. Mechanisms would develop for mediation and reconciliation. Perhaps certain individuals would be recognized as fair arbiters. Perhaps rituals would exist for making amends and restoring harmony. Yet within this collective framework, individuality would still exist. People would have different personalities, different talents, different dreams. The person who's best at hunting might not be the leader of the community. The person who tells the best stories might not be the best parent. All types of people and talents would have value, contributing to the whole in different ways. Romance and courtship would be interesting in such a society. Marriages would likely be somewhat arranged, or at least heavily influenced by family, because they're not just about personal happiness but about alliances and the practical matter of combining resources. But that doesn't mean there wouldn't be love. Couples would grow into love over years of shared work and shared life. And young people would still feel attraction, still find ways to flirt and signal interest within the acceptable social bounds. Celebrations would be cherished events, breaking the monotony of survival routines. The end of winter darkness would call for festivals with special foods, music, dancing, and games. Successful hunts might be celebrated with feasts where the meat is shared throughout the community. Personal milestones like weddings or a young person's first successful solo hunt would be marked with ceremony and joy. Games and competitions would provide entertainment and also serve practical purposes. Archery contests, racing, tests of strength, these would all be fun but also ways to hone skills that matter for survival. They would provide a way for young people to prove themselves and for the community to identify individuals with exceptional talents. As people age, their roles would shift. The very old might not be able to contribute physical labor anymore, but they would be valued as repositories of knowledge and wisdom. They would be the teachers, the storytellers, the advisors. Caring for the elderly would be understood as both a duty and an investment, because everyone hopes to reach old age themselves, and the treatment of elders sets the standard for what can be expected later. Death would be understood as a natural part of life's cycle, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be mourned. Funerals would be important rituals, helping the living process their grief and say goodbye. The body might be placed in the frozen ground, preserved by the permafrost, or perhaps cremated with the ashes scattered in a meaningful place. Stories would be told about the deceased, keeping their memory alive in the community. And through all of this, through the daily routines and the special occasions, through the hardships and the joys, there would be an understanding that life is precious precisely because it's fragile, and that community matters because no one can survive alone, and that the simple pleasures, warmth, food, companionship, stories, laughter, are what make life worth living even in the harshest environment. Would this world be sad or peaceful? This is where we need to pause and really think about something important. When we imagine a world locked in eternal ice, it's easy to project our own fears onto it, to assume it would be grim and miserable and desperate. But would it really? Consider for a moment that the people living in this world wouldn't experience it as we might if we were suddenly transported there. They wouldn't be missing warmth because they've never known a warmer world. They wouldn't long for tropical beaches or summer sun because those concepts would be as alien to them as living underwater is to us. Instead, they would know their world intimately, love it even, in the way humans have always found beauty in their environment no matter where they live. They would see things we might miss, the infinite varieties of snow and ice, the subtle colors in the northern lights, the way morning light glints off frost crystals, the profound silence of a calm winter day. There would be hardships, certainly. Life would be physically demanding. The constant cold would be challenging. Resources would be limited. But humans are remarkably adaptable, and what seems like deprivation to an outsider might simply be normal to someone raised in that environment. In fact, there are reasons to think this frozen world might actually be more peaceful than our own in some important ways. Consider warfare. In our world, conflicts and wars have often been driven by competition for resources, desires for expansion, and the ability to project military power over long distances. But in a world where travel is difficult, where maintaining an army in the field would be incredibly challenging, where every community is focused primarily on survival, large-scale warfare would be rare if not impossible. That doesn't mean conflict wouldn't exist. Disputes over hunting grounds or resources would surely occur. Raids or skirmishes between neighboring groups might happen. But the kind of massive wars that have plagued human history in our timeline, involving thousands or millions of soldiers, sustained campaigns over months or years, the destruction of entire cities, these would be far less likely. The difficulty of travel and the isolation of communities would naturally limit the scale of conflicts. And the harsh environment would encourage cooperation more than competition, because everyone would understand that resources are limited and survival is precarious. Communities would likely develop strong traditions of hospitality and mutual aid. A traveler arriving at your settlement, half frozen and exhausted, wouldn't be turned away even if they were a stranger or from a distant group. Helping them would be both a moral imperative and a practical investment, because one day you might be that traveler, desperate for shelter and warmth. Trade networks would exist, as we discussed, but they would be based on mutual benefit and maintained through trust and reputation rather than enforced by military might. If a community gains a reputation for cheating trading partners, others would simply refuse to deal with them, and in a world where resources are limited, being cut off from trade networks could be devastating. The pace of life would be slower, and this might not be entirely a bad thing. In our modern world, we're constantly rushing, always connected, bombarded with information and stimuli. Mental health issues like anxiety and depression are epidemic. We've lost connection with natural rhythms, with seasons, with the simple experience of being present in the moment. In the frozen world, life would move at the speed of seasons and glaciers. There would be time for contemplation, for craftsmanship, for deep conversations, for simply sitting and watching the snow fall. The long winter nights would provide hours for storytelling, music, and art. People would know their neighbors deeply, not as names on social media but as actual humans they interact with daily. There would be a strong sense of meaning and purpose. Everyone's contribution would matter visibly and immediately. If you're good at hunting, your skill directly feeds the community. If you're good at sewing, your work keeps people alive. If you're good at storytelling, you preserve culture and educate the young. There wouldn't be the alienation that many people feel in modern society, where their work seems disconnected from any meaningful outcome. Mental health might actually be better in some ways. While the hardships would create stress, the strong community bonds, the clear sense of purpose, and the slower pace of life might protect against some of the psychological issues that plague modern humans. Depression would surely exist, but it might be less common when everyone is connected to community and when everyone's contribution clearly matters. The relationship with nature would be more direct and honest. In our world, many people live almost entirely insulated from natural systems, buying food from stores without thinking about where it came from, controlling their environment with heating and cooling, rarely experiencing genuine wilderness. But in the frozen world, people would be intimately connected to nature. They would understand that they're part of the ecosystem, not separate from it or above it. This connection might foster a different kind of wisdom, a deep understanding of ecological relationships, of sustainability, of living within limits. People would know in their bones that you can't take more than the land can give, that waste is not just inefficient but dangerous, that every action has consequences. There would also be a certain equality born of shared struggle. While hierarchies would exist, they would be based more on competence and wisdom than on wealth or birthright. A person's value would come from what they contribute and how they treat others, not from how much they own. Women, as we discussed earlier, might have more equality than in many historical societies in our timeline, simply because in a world where survival is so challenging, every capable person's contribution is needed regardless of gender. A woman who can hunt or heal or craft or lead would be valued for those abilities. Children would grow up with clear models of adult life, knowing from an early age what skills they need to learn and what role they might play in the community. There wouldn't be the extended adolescence and identity confusion that characterizes modern life. This might mean less freedom in some ways, but it might also mean less anxiety and uncertainty. Of course, we shouldn't romanticize this world too much. It would have its own problems. Isolation could breed superstition or xenophobia. Small communities might be stifling for individuals who don't fit in. The lack of medical technology would mean that injuries or illnesses that are treatable in our world would be death sentences. Infant mortality would be high. Average lifespan would be shorter. But the question isn't whether this world would be perfect. It wouldn't be, any more than our world is perfect. The question is whether it would be sad or peaceful, and the answer is probably both and neither. It would be a world where suffering exists, where people grieve and struggle and sometimes fail. But it would also be a world where beauty exists, where people love and create and find joy in small moments. Where a father teaching his daughter to carve bone feels proud of her first successful attempt. Where a mother nurses her infant by firelight, feeling that primal love that transcends circumstances. Where friends laugh together while preparing a meal. Where an elder tells a story that makes children's eyes light up with wonder. It would be a world where people appreciate warmth because they know cold, where they cherish community because they understand loneliness, where they celebrate spring because they've endured winter. Perhaps most importantly, It would be a world where humans haven't yet developed the technologies and systems that allow some to exploit others on a massive scale. There would be no billionaires and no homeless, no advertising manipulating desires, no pollution poisoning the environment, no existential threat of nuclear weapons or climate change. The problems would be immediate and visible: finding enough food, staying warm, treating an injury, resolving a dispute. But they would be solvable on a human scale, through human effort and ingenuity and cooperation. So would it be sad or peaceful? Maybe the answer is that it would be deeply, authentically human in a way that our complex modern world sometimes isn't. It would be a world where life is hard but meaningful, where community is essential and therefore strong, where the pace allows for depth, and where humans live in balance with their environment not by choice but by necessity. A gentle ending. And so we come to the end of our journey together through this imagined frozen world. We've walked across endless snow. We've descended into warm underground cities. We've met mammoths and dire wolves. We've sat by fires listening to stories. We've imagined technologies adapted to ice and innovations born of necessity. But here's the thing about alternate histories and imagined worlds: they're really just mirrors held up to our own reality. When we imagine how life might be different, we're really asking questions about our own lives. In our real world, the Ice Age did end. The glaciers retreated. The climate warmed. And that warmth allowed for the development of agriculture, cities, civilizations, and eventually the complex technological society we live in today. We have comforts those frozen world humans would find miraculous. Warmth at the touch of a button, food from anywhere in the world available year-round, instant communication across any distance, medical care that can cure diseases and heal injuries that would have been fatal to our ancestors. But we've also lost some things. We've lost the deep connection to nature and seasons. We've lost the strong community bonds that come from genuine interdependence. We've lost the slower pace that allows for presence and contemplation. We've gained comfort, but sometimes at the cost of meaning. The frozen world we've imagined tonight wouldn't be better or worse than ours, just different. The humans living there would face different challenges, develop different solutions, and find different sources of joy and meaning. And maybe that's the real lesson here, that humans are remarkably adaptable, that we can find ways to survive and even thrive in almost any conditions, that we can create beauty and meaning anywhere, that the circumstances matter less than how we respond to them. In the frozen world, people would tell stories around fires. In our world, we tell stories too, just in different ways. We're all storytellers. We're all trying to make sense of our existence. We're all looking for connection, for meaning, for beauty in our particular environment. The Ice Age ended 10,000 years ago, but the human capacity for adaptation, creativity, cooperation, and finding joy in small moments, that hasn't changed. We're still the same species that survived ice ages and learned to thrive in environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforests. And our world continues to change. The climate is warming now just as it once cooled. We face new challenges: how to live sustainably, how to maintain human connection in an increasingly digital world, how to find meaning in lives of unprecedented comfort and complexity. Perhaps we can learn something from the imagined humans of the frozen world. Their focus on community, their appreciation for small comforts, their understanding that they're part of nature, not separate from it, their slower pace, their deep cultural traditions, their recognition that every person's contribution matters. We can't return to a simpler time, and we probably wouldn't want to if we really understood what that would mean. But we can choose to incorporate some of those values into our own lives. We can slow down sometimes. We can be more present. We can strengthen our communities. We can appreciate what we have. We can live more sustainably. Both cold and warmth shape life. Both challenge and comfort have their place. Every world has beauty if we know how to see it. Every life has meaning if we know how to live it. The ice may have melted, but the stars still shine overhead. The same stars that would guide travelers across frozen plains in our imagined world. The same stars that have watched over humanity through ice ages and warm periods, through all our struggles and triumphs. And under those stars, whether in a warm underground city or a modern apartment, whether 10,000 years ago or today, humans do the same things. We gather together. We tell stories. We care for each other. We create. We dream. We wonder. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, know that you're part of that long, unbroken chain of human experience. Know that you carry within you the same adaptability and resilience that allowed our species to survive ice ages and everything else the world has thrown at us. Know that whatever challenges you face, you have within you the capacity to meet them. Rest now. Let the images of this frozen world fade gently from your mind. Let yourself sink into the comfort of your bed. Tomorrow is a new day in our warmer world, but for now, just rest. The mammoths are sleeping in the snow. The fires are banked in the underground cities. The stars are wheeling overhead. And all is well. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you enjoyed this peaceful exploration, remember to leave a like and subscribe for more calm history and science content to help you drift into sleep. Until next time, rest well, dream peacefully, and may your own world, warm or cold, be filled with beauty and meaning. Good night.